the faithfulness of God, the goodness of God. That's just, 2 words to keep in mind as we progress this morning. I want to preach. I want to speak from and take as a text reading Matthew 5:5, which is the third of the Beatitudes, which says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." But I want to read, because I kind of think that's a very familiar chapter, and you know that quite well, and you can kind of keep your thumb in there, as it were, but just keep that verse in mind. But I want to read part of Psalm 37, not all of Psalm 37, because it's got 40 verses, so it'll take a little while to read it all. But we will read up to, I think, about verse 27. And so Psalm 37. Now, you might be interested to know that third beatitude, well, you probably already know this because you know your Bibles probably better than I do. But that third beatitude, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," is lifted and quoted verbatim from Psalm 37. Now, we're not going to accuse Jesus of plagiarism, but we are going to say that he really, really knew his scriptures. And I love those links between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And sometimes we don't recognize them, sometimes we don't. So it's just saying that when Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth," he was thinking of Psalm 37 as he said those words, and deliberately using those words in another context. So Psalm 37. "Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming. The wicked draws the sword, the wicked draw the sword and bend their bows to bring down the poor and needy, to slay those whose way is upright. Their sword shall enter their own heart, and their bow shall be broken. Better is the little that the righteous has than the abundance of many wicked. For the arms of the wicked shall be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their heritage will remain forever. They're not put to shame in evil times. In the days of famine, they have abundance. But the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke, they vanish away. The wicked borrows, but does not pay back. But the righteous is generous and gives. For those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. I have been young, and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. Turn away from evil and do good, so shall you dwell forever. So I don't know whether you're aware of the fact, but it's the autumn equinox this weekend. And I think tomorrow is the day when night is pretty much the same length as day, when we get that kind of equal amounts of daylight and darkness, as it were. So we're leaving behind the glorious long days of summer, and we're continuing on that downhill track towards the depths of darkness in December before eventually it starts to pick up again. And traditionally at this time of year, in churches up and down the land, round about the autumn equinox, you would get churches celebrating the Harvest Festival. Now, I don't know whether you do anything Harvest Festival-ish here or not. I don't know about that. And if you do, it's on a different Sunday to this. But at this time of year, I want to do something slightly different today. I want us to think about our relationship with the land. So Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And I want to kind of think about what that means and what our relationship is with the land. I just spotted in the news this morning that there had been a bit of a demonstration in a place on the Scottish-English border, a place called the Scots Dyke. I don't know whether you've ever heard of the Scots Dyke or not. It's all kind of rooted in history, and it goes back to sort of the border reivers days, when, you know, on that Scottish-English border, there was a lot of bad stuff happening and people pinching cows and taking them north of the border, and then people going back and pinching them back and burning people's houses. And so all along that border, on either side, there was 3 marches, what they called marches, 3 areas, east, west, and in the middle, on either side of the border, and a warden for each march, and they would try and control all these families. So I don't know if there's anybody here with a surname like Armstrong or Scott or Elliot, and lots of other Charlton, lots of other surnames. Your ancestors were involved in all of this because it was various families. Have we got any yet? We had Scott, right, a Scott, yeah, well, you probably know all about this, you know, and if you don't, you need to find out. The Armstrongs actually were the worst, so they were the worst. And round about where the Armstrongs were, on the western part of the border, there was a little bit of land, a sliver of land called the Debatable Lands, and it ran really from the Solway Firth, the edge of the Solway Firth, up to the Scottish town of Langholm. About 10 miles long and about 4 miles wide. And from the 12th century onwards, this little sliver of land was given over to grazing cattle, and no one was allowed to build a house on it. So it was kind of this no man's land, and it was called the Debatable Land, until eventually the Scots Dyke was established, and part of it was given to England and part of it was given to Scotland. But it was this, and it's still called the Debatable Land. And people were demonstrating there yesterday in support, calling for a right to roam in England. So there's a right to roam in Scotland. You can go wherever you like in Scotland, apart from other people's gardens. You can go anywhere you like. You can trample over any farmer's field that you want to and take your dog and trample it all down. You can tell I'm a farmer, can't you? But in England, you're not allowed to do that. So the various ramblers groups were protesting about that. So the Debatable Land, this kind of contentious issue, whose land is it? 18 months ago, Rachel and I had the very great privilege of travelling to the Holy Land. If that's something that you've always wanted to do but haven't done it, I really encourage you to do so. It was an absolutely wonderful and a very rich experience. To be able to kind of be in those places that we read about in the Gospels. It's just awesome, it really, really is. But as well as that, there were some kind of other things that we were able to engage with a little bit, like, for instance, the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum. That was, you know, quite an awesome and humbling experience to go there. But also to engage a little bit with the political stuff. So I'm of a certain age, and I remember when I was growing up, we used to hear all the time in the news various things, but one of the recurring themes was the problems in Israel and Palestine and all the troubles that went on there. And one of the things that used to get talked about was the Golan Heights. And I remember as a kind of a teenager thinking, oh, I'd love one day to go to the Golan Heights and see what they look like, because it kind of, you know, conjured up a certain image in my mind. The Golan Heights became really famous because that's kind of the border between Israel and Syria. And in 1973, there was a war that was called the Yom Kippur War. I'm not going to go into any detail over that. Look it up if you want to find out a little bit more about it. But of course, very long story short, overnight, the Syrian forces in the north and the Egyptian forces in the south invaded Israel. And it was kind of an existential threat to Israel. And for a moment, kind of a few hours in time, it seemed as though the state of Israel would be overrun. But they kind of got themselves together and eventually they pushed the Syrians back into Syria again up on the Golan Heights. And so we went there and we stood on the border and we looked out over this land that is called the Golan Heights. And I expected it to be a desert, but it's not. It's really fertile and productive land. And you can see where the border is and which is Syria and which and because it's high up, you can look out over this expanse of land. And just to note that at the heart of that war and the ongoing problems in the Middle East is a fight over land. Whose land is it? Who has the right to claim this land as theirs? So this happens all over. It happens on the border between Scotland and England. In the debatable land, it happens on the border between Israel and Syria. It happens all over the world. Now, as we come to the third beatitude, we read these words of Jesus: "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." You'll have heard probably several sermons on this, and you will have an idea in your own mind what you were thinking about, what the earth means to you. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth," you will have an idea what you think that means. When I was kind of thinking about preaching and feeling led to preach on this particular text, I kind of did a little bit of research and looked up, what the commentaries say and all this kind of stuff. And I found that almost always, when people look at this text, the focus is on the meek. Blessed are the meek. And nobody really thinks about or expands on what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the earth. So what I want to do this morning is to start off with the earth, the land bit, if you like, and then come back and finish off with what it means to be the meek who will inherit the earth. So, as we've already noted, Jesus lifted this verse from Psalm 37. A little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. Now, I want to just explore, and please, this will be very quick, so don't promise me you won't go to sleep at this point. Please just stick with me because it's important. So obviously the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and the New Testament is written in Greek. And then we have got our English translations of the Hebrew and the Greek. So we've kind of got to work in three languages at this point to understand what's going on, because Jesus quotes Psalm 37 written in Hebrew. His words in Matthew come down to us in Greek, and then we've translated them into English. So the word for earth or for land in Hebrew is the word eretz, E-R-E-T-Z. And you will sometimes hear a phrase, Eretz Israel. And that literally means the land of Israel. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. When we move from the Old Testament into the New Testament, Eretz is translated into the Greek of the New Testament by the word ge, G-E, ge. And from that word, that Greek word ge, ge, we get words like geographic, geothermal, geology, all those kinds of words that have got to do with the land and with earth. And both those words, the Hebrew word and the Greek word, are variously translated as earth or land or ground. So both of them have a kind of a range of meanings. So if we understand Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, simply to kind of be some pious hope about the future, like pie in the sky when you die kind of thing, that one day, hang in there, you meek people, hang in there, because one day you are going to get your reward. One day everything is going to be yours. If we think like that, if that's what we think about when we read that verse, I don't think we've fully understood just how important and significant and how grounded in like everyday reality and our everyday situations it is. It's not just about what's going to happen one day, it's about what matters now. So, earth, land, ground. It was Mark Twain who very famously, many years ago, advised investors to buy land because they're not making it anymore. And if that was true way back then, it's even more true now. I remember many years ago, my dad, because, you know, come from a farming family, my dad deciding he was going to buy some fields. And I think he must have been trying to encourage me, because he asked my advice. He said, do you think I should go for it? And I said, oh, yeah, definitely. Not that I knew anything, because he was thinking it was a bit expensive at the time. The price of that land now has gone up 20 times to what it was then. So buy land. They're not making it anymore. It is a limited asset. So, you know, it will always have a value. Not only are they not making land anymore, but the pressure on the land that we inhabit is just growing all the time. So last autumn, about a year ago, the global population passed the 8 billion mark, and we're on a trajectory. The good news is that the population of the world will eventually start tailing off, but not before we reach a peak of about 10.5 billion in, I think it's 2066 or something. It's forecast to rise and then to slowly ease off a little bit. So in 100 years, between 1925 and 2023, the global population quadrupled. It went from 2 billion to 8 billion. So we're a fairly successful species, us humans, but we're putting a lot of pressure on this planet, on the land that we inhabit, the land that God created and gave to us. And what is more, we as human beings, particularly in the developed world, are just consuming more and more all the time. So the pressure we put on the land that we walk on is growing all the time. Now, if the word that we have always translated as earth, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, also carries the meaning of land, how does that help us to understand this beatitude? Well, first of all, it takes us right back into the Old Testament. It takes us right back to Abraham, you know, who moved from one piece of land to another piece of land. It takes us back to Moses and the Exodus and the people of Israel moving across the wilderness, moving into this land that had been promised to them in that wonderful and evocative phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey. What a wonderful place to come into. And this is their inheritance. Where Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Well, I think he's deliberately thinking about how the people of Israel inherited the land, a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So the promised land was given to the people of Israel. It wasn't something that they bought. It wasn't what the Americans call real estate that they bought. It wasn't earned. It was given to them by God. It was their inheritance. But also it belonged to the people of God by right. So when we read, the meek shall inherit the land, that is automatically an indication of God's generosity. It is God's good gift. And it's also an indicator that we will know, because it is God's good gift, that the land that is inherited by the meek will be a good land. It will be, as it were, a land flowing with milk and honey. But it is, nevertheless, rightly the possession of the meek. So the possession of land is always a contentious business. So we see that with Israel and Syria, we see it with England and Scotland, we see it in all kinds of places. I don't know whether you live in a street where you've got neighbours who are at war over a hedge, somebody's tried to move the boundary, you know, a couple of inches, and it all kicks off, and sometimes occasionally it even gets into the Chronicle because it's been in the courts. You know, it seems as though sometimes that business over whose land it is brings out the very worst in us. What's going on in Ukraine right now, if it isn't just a kind of a struggle over whose land it is, who has the right to call this particular place theirs. And we haven't got as much land as we think we have. It's a big world, isn't it, that we live in? It's a very big world that we live in. I've just come back from America, and we travelled 500 miles across South Dakota. If you ever get a chance to drive across South Dakota, take plenty of things with you to amuse you, because mile after mile goes by and there is not a lot happening. Just field after field of maize growing. So it seems like a big world, but we actually haven't got as much land as we think we have. So 70% of the world's surface is covered in water. It's ocean. Basically, we just leaves 30% of it as dry land. Out of that 30%, 10% of that 30% is covered in ice and snow. 19% is covered in desert. 34% is covered in trees and shrubs. So that just leaves 34% of the 30%, as it were, to feed over 8 billion people. So land has a lot of work to do. It feeds us, it clothes us, it provides leisure and beauty, it forms our identity. I don't know what you call yourself today in terms of your identity. Are you English, British, whatever? But part of that is because of the land that you inhabit. And somehow that land also has to sustain things like biodiversity and life in a multitude of forms. And to be fair, we're beginning to understand that the land that we walk on is creaking at the seams. So if the land that is ours is the inheritance of the meek, then unfortunately the inheritance of the meek is being devalued by the day. So when God gave his people the inheritance of land back in the Old Testament, it was two things. It was a gift and it was a responsibility. The land was fertile and it would feed them, it would house them, it would clothe them, it would give them the identity that they grew into. It would be a place where they could put down roots and bring up families. But this land would also have boundaries. And into those boundaries, they were encouraged, they were told to welcome the widow, the orphan, the stranger. So this land, the inheritance of the meek, came with responsibility. It was to be their inheritance. Now, as Jesus promises that the land is the inheritance of the meek, that is both encouraging, but it's also quite chastening for us, because it asks us to ask ourselves whether we're part of the meek and what it means to be the meek, the people who receive this inheritance. And this is where Psalm 37 is really helpful, the psalm that Jesus quotes in Matthew chapter 5. And there are four things that I just want to pick up on that help us to understand what our relationship as followers of Jesus and worshippers of God are with the land that we inhabit. And in verse 3, the first thing I want to highlight, which is perhaps the most important thing, verse 3, it tells us that the meek are those who put their trust in God. Trust in the Lord, it says, and do good, dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. This will always be our starting point. It's our starting point in everything. But when we seek to be disciples of Jesus, when we seek to be worshippers of God, to honour and acknowledge his sovereignty and his might, then that applies to every part of our lives. So we need to trust God in everything, not just in coming to church on a Sunday and what that means, but in everything that we do and everything that we consume and all that we are. Our starting point is to trust in the Lord, and then what flows from that, and do good. This is our starting point, especially when we explore what it means to be meek and to be humble. To be meek, to be humble, to be those who trust in the Lord, is fundamentally to recognize our own limitations as human beings and to acknowledge God's limitless resources, and not to think of it the other way around, as we're often tempted to do. So who are the meek? The meek are those who trust in the Lord. Secondly, the meek are those who walk gently in the land. Verse 7 says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him." Several times the Bible tells us to be still before the Lord, to be quiet, to be gentle, to wait, to listen. How important is that? I'm a bit of a book lover. I have way too many books, but I love them and I read all the time. One of my favourite books is a little book, and it's called Walk Soft in the Fold, and it's written by a guy who was a Methodist minister, Reverend David Nixon. And when I was a teenager growing up, he was minister in Weardale, and he used to come and preach at the churches in our area from time to time. And, you know, when I wasn't a minister, I used to sit where you're sitting today. And like you, I've heard hundreds of sermons. And you know, a lot of them have just gone like that. A little bit like this morning. A lot of them have just gone like that. But I can remember one of the sermons that David Nixon preached, as though it was yesterday, and it'll be 50 years ago, probably, as though it was yesterday. And he came to our Harvest Festival and he talked about the poverty of abundance. That's what he talked about. And he gave this illustration of when he was working on a farm as a young lad. And this farmer, it was at that time when farmers were pulling out hedgerows and taking down trees. And this farmer wanted to take all these trees out of this hedge so he could make his field bigger. And the council said to him, "They're really important trees, those, you can't take them down, there's an order on them." So he said, when spring came, he said they cleaned out all the yards, took all the manure out of the yards, and they put it in trailers, and they took it over to where these trees were and piled it up around these trees. And this young lad, David Nixon, said, "I thought, hey, they're going to really do well now." Well, of course, they didn't, did they? Pretty soon the trees died. So they chopped them down and everything was all right. Vandalism, isn't it? But I remember that. It's got nothing to do with what I'm saying now, but I remember that. But in this book, Walk Soft in the Fold, he goes back to a time when he just left school. So this guy's probably 14 or 15, and he goes to work on this farm in the south of England. And they've got sheep there. And they used to fold the sheep in those days. What they used to do was to bring them into a field and work across the field a little bit at a time. So the sheep would sort of be confined in small areas. And, you know, some of you are 14, 15, so you're a little bit wild and you rush around. And sometimes your mum and dad say, "Can you just chill a little bit? Can you just, you know, take it easy?" So he was like this on this farm. And he was rushing around in amongst the sheep, and the sheep were scattering all ways. And the shepherd he was working for, an old guy called Edgar Kirby, and he used a naughty word, and I'm not going to use it, but he said, "Stop running around like a stupid blue bottle and learn to walk soft in the fold." I think that's a beautiful expression. Learn to walk soft, to walk gently. And the psalmist says, David says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him." So the meek are those who walk soft over the earth, those who are gentle, those who are careful about what they do, because they know that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And this is something that they've been given stewardship over. And so the meek are those who grieve at the way humanity has imposed itself on nature, the way that the land has been poisoned and stripped, the way that humans have stopped listening and learning and instead have imposed their wills and ignored the consequences. So the meek are those who walk softly and gently over God's good earth. Theirs are not the boots of armies, theirs are the bare feet of peace that walk gently. And thirdly, the meek are those who do not grab for themselves. Sometimes you hear people say we've got a very extractive mind view. We're always grabbing things, we're always taking things out of the earth, and that's got to stop because that is a finite resource. And so in verses 21 and 22 in Psalm 37, it says, the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. So the meek are those who do not grab for themselves. And this is especially true when it comes to land, you know, whether it's the debatable land or it's the Golan Heights or it's Ukraine or just two neighbours having a dispute over a hedge and a drive. It's grab, grab, grab. That is mine. I want that for myself. But the meek, in their wisdom, know that to inherit the earth, to inherit the land, is just to be the latest in a long line of stewards who are caring for that particular piece of land. And to inherit the land is also to embrace a duty of care. So the meek are those who do not grab for themselves. And fourthly, finally, the meek are those who cooperate rather than compete. Verses 25 and 26 says this, I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. They are always generous and lend freely, and their children will be a blessing. The meek are those who are generous, who lend freely, who are a blessing to others. They're not those who are desiring to grab more and get more and keep it for themselves. They realize that what God has given them is theirs to share and to use that to be a blessing to others. Those who cooperate rather than compete. Now, as you look at your character and personality, you might say, oh, well, unfortunately, I wasn't born meek. I'm a bit of a fighter. That's one of my strengths. Well, yeah, we might not all be born meek. I have 4 children. I could tell you quite clearly what their different personalities are. And I can tell you that child number 2 isn't the meek one. She is the one who would always cause the problems, but she has many other strengths despite that. Well, we might not all be born meek, but that meekness can be nurtured and can grow within us as we stay close to God and as we seek his face and as we ask his forgiveness and as we invite him into our lives on a daily basis. And remember this, and I know it's been a little bit different this morning, but remember this because this is really important when we're thinking about how grounded we are, how we kind of, you know, for a season, we're here on this earth and our feet are touching the ground, you know, whether it's the tarmac and the concrete of the city or whether it's the green fields of the countryside. Remember this earth, this land that we inhabit is precious and is worthy of our utmost respect because this is the land that Jesus blessed with his feet, with his presence when he left the glory of heaven and he came and for a little while he walked among us and his feet touched the earth that our feet touched. He came amongst us, his majesty clothed what? In meekness, and he hallowed the very ground that he walked on and that we now are stewards of in our time and our generation. And he calls us to repentance. He calls us to a life of obedience and service. And in responding to that call, to give our lives to him, we find freedom and we become the meek who are the inheritors of the land. Let's just pray together. Lord Jesus, we thank you for those words that you spoke. Sometimes, Lord, we just skip over those beatitudes, but we thank you that you said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And Lord, you weren't just thinking about the future, perhaps there was something of that in it, but you were thinking about the here and the now. The meek didn't have to wait for some glorious future, but you were going to bless them right now. And we in our time are the meek who inherit the earth, the land that we live in. We pray, Lord, that you would help us to understand just what a rich inheritance that is. That you would give us grateful hearts for all that you have given us, but that you would help us to carry out the responsibility of stewards of that land. Help us to understand, Lord, that all that you have given to us is for us to share, that our lives, that our inheritance as your meek people might be a blessing and encouragement to others. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.